Picture this. You walk into what should be your own neighborhood coffee shop, the same place you've visited hundreds of times, where you know the baristas by name and they know your order by heart. But today, something feels different. Eyes follow you with uncomfortable intensity. Whispers float through the air like smoke. Then someone approaches you with those 4 words that can shatter a person's sense of belonging in an instant. This isn't your place. What would you do? How would you respond when faced with prejudice so raw, so unexpected that it takes your breath away? Would you fight back? Would you walk away? Would you try to explain who you are and why you deserve to be there? For Marcus Thompson, a decorated Navy SEAL who had spent 12 years defending the very freedoms that were being denied to him in that moment, the answer wasn't as simple as his military training might have prepared him for. Because sometimes the most dangerous battles aren't fought in foreign lands with clear enemies and defined missions. Sometimes they happen in your own backyard, where the lines between right and wrong blur, and where victory isn't measured in territory gained, but in dignity preserved. This is the true story of what happened when a hero came home, only to discover that the fight for respect and belonging was far from over. It's a story about courage that goes beyond the battlefield, about the kind of strength that doesn't come from weapons or training, but from the unshakable belief that every person deserves to be treated with basic human decency. What Marcus did next would change not just his own life, but the lives of everyone in that small Pennsylvania town. Because sometimes, the most powerful weapon a person can wield is simply the truth. Marcus Thompson adjusted his civilian clothes one more time as he stepped off the Greyhound bus in Millfield, Pennsylvania. After 12 years of Navy SEAL service, 3 tours in Afghanistan, and more classified missions than he could count, he was finally home. The small town looked exactly as he remembered it from his childhood visits to his grandmother's house. Except now it would be his permanent home. At 34, Marcus was ready to trade his combat boots for something more peaceful. The September afternoon sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Marcus pulled his single duffel bag over his shoulder. Everything he owned in the world fit in that bag, which seemed strange for someone who had dedicated over a decade of his life to serving his country. But material possessions had never been important to him. What mattered was the sense of purpose, the brotherhood of his fellow SEALs, and the knowledge that he was making a difference. Now, he needed to find a new kind of purpose. His grandmother, Eleanor Thompson, had passed away 6 months earlier, leaving him her small house on Maple Street and enough money to get by for a while. She had always been his anchor, the one person who wrote to him faithfully during every deployment, who sent care packages filled with her famous chocolate chip cookies, and who never failed to tell him how proud she were of him. When the lawyer called to tell him about the inheritance, Marcus knew it was a sign. It was time to come home. The walk from the bus station to Maple Street took him through the heart of Millfield. He passed the same barber shop where his grandmother used to take him for haircuts, the hardware store where she would buy supplies for her endless home improvement projects, and the small diner where she would treat him to vanilla milkshakes. Everything looked smaller than he remembered, but that was normal. When you've seen the world, when you've been to places most people only read about in newspapers, your perspective changes. Marcus stopped in front of Bailey's Coffee House, a new addition to Main Street that hadn't been there during his last visit 3 years ago. Through the large windows, he could see people chatting over steaming mugs, college students hunched over laptops, and what looked like a book club meeting in the corner. It reminded him of the coffee shops in San Diego near the naval base, places where he and his teammates would grab a quick caffeine fix before training exercises. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and Marcus immediately felt the warmth of the space. The walls were painted a soft yellow, local artwork hung in simple frames, and the aroma of freshly ground coffee beans filled the air. Behind the counter, a young woman with curly red hair smiled at him. "Welcome to Bailey's," she said cheerfully. "What can I get you today?" Marcus approached the counter, suddenly aware that several conversations had quieted since he entered. He chalked it up to small-town curiosity about a new face. In places like Millfield, everyone knew everyone, and a stranger was bound to draw attention. "I'll take a large black coffee, please," he said, his voice carrying the crisp tone that came from years of military training. The barista, whose name tag read Emma, nodded and turned to the coffee machine. As she worked, Marcus let his eyes wander around the shop. He noticed an older man in a plaid shirt staring at him intently, and when their eyes met, The man quickly looked away. A group of women near the window had their heads together, whispering and occasionally glancing in his direction. "Here you go," Emma said, sliding the coffee across the counter. "That'll be $3.50. Marcus handed her a $5 bill and told her to keep the change. As he turned to find a seat, he nearly collided with a tall man in his 50s wearing a sheriff's badge. "Excuse me," the sheriff said, but his tone wasn't apologetic. It was questioning, almost challenging. "No problem," Marcus replied, stepping to the side. The sheriff looked him up and down, taking in his neat appearance, his straight posture, and the disciplined way he carried himself. "You're not from around here," the sheriff said. "It wasn't a question. Actually, I am." Marcus answered calmly. "My grandmother was Eleanor Thompson. I inherited her house on Maple Street." Something shifted in the sheriff's expression, though Marcus couldn't quite identify what it was. Recognition, maybe, or surprise. "Eleanor Thompson," the sheriff repeated slowly. "Fine woman. Sorry for your loss. Thank you." The sheriff extended his hand. "I'm Sheriff Bradley. Tom Bradley." Marcus shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and the way Bradley's eyes never left his face. "Marcus Thompson. Well, Mr. Thompson, welcome to Millfield. Hope you'll find everything you need here." There was something in the way he said it that made Marcus pause, but before he could respond, Sheriff Bradley had moved past him to the counter. Marcus found an empty table near the back of the shop and settled in with his coffee, pulling out a notebook where he'd been jotting down ideas for what to do with his new life. The coffee was good, better than the instant stuff he'd grown accustomed to in the field. He opened his notebook and began writing, trying to organize his thoughts about job possibilities, home repairs that needed to be done, and ways to get involved in the community. His grandmother had always been active in local causes, and he wanted to honor her memory by following her example. As he wrote, Marcus became aware that the shop had grown quieter. The easy chatter from earlier had been replaced by hushed conversations and the occasional scrape of a chair. He looked up to find several people watching him, their expressions ranging from curious to uncomfortable to something else entirely. A middle-aged woman with graying hair approached his table. She wore a cardigan despite the warm weather and clutched a small purse in front of her like a shield. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you really Eleanor Thompson's grandson?" Marcus set down his pen and looked up at her. "Yes, ma'am, I am. It's just that, well, she never mentioned—" The woman trailed off, glancing around the shop as if looking for support from the other patrons. "She never mentioned what?" Marcus asked gently. "She never mentioned that you were—" Another pause, longer this time. "Well, that, you were black." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach, but his expression remained calm. Years of military discipline had taught him to control his reactions, to think before responding to unexpected situations. "Thompson was my father's mother," Marcus explained, his voice steady. "My father was white, my mother was black. My grandmother loved me exactly as I am." The woman's face reddened. "Oh, I didn't mean... I just thought..." She fumbled for words, clearly flustered by the conversation. "Is there something else I can help you with?" Marcus asked, maintaining his polite tone despite the growing tension in the room. "No, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." The woman hurried back to her table, where two other women immediately leaned in to hear what she had to say. Marcus returned to his notebook, but concentration was difficult now. He could feel eyes on him, could sense the shift in the atmosphere. The welcoming warmth he'd felt when he first entered Bailey's had been replaced by something else entirely, something that made his skin crawl and his jaw tighten. He had experienced racism before, of course, growing up biracial in various towns across the country. As his military family moved from base to base, he'd encountered his share of ignorance and prejudice. The military had been different, though. In the SEALs, what mattered was your ability to do the job, your loyalty to your teammates, and your dedication to the mission. Skin color was irrelevant when you were watching each other's backs in hostile territory. But this was different. This was his hometown now. The place where his beloved grandmother had lived for 60 years, where she had been respected and cherished by the community. How could these same people look at him with such suspicion and discomfort? Marcus finished his coffee and closed his notebook. As he stood to leave, he noticed that conversations stopped entirely. Every eye in the shop was on him as he walked to the door. The bell chimed again as he exited, and through the window he could see heads turning to watch him walk down the street. The walk to his grandmother's house took 10 minutes, but it felt much longer. Marcus found himself analyzing every person he passed, every car that slowed down, every curtain that twitched in a window. His military training had made him naturally observant, but now that heightened awareness felt less like a professional skill and more like a survival mechanism. The house on Maple Street was exactly as he remembered it. A small, well-maintained craftsman bungalow with a wraparound porch and a garden that his grandmother had tended with loving care. The key was where the lawyer said it would be, under a loose brick in the front walkway. As Marcus unlocked the front door, he half expected to smell his grandmother's perfume or hear her voice calling out a greeting. Instead, he found silence and the faint scent of the lavender sachets she used to keep in her linen closets. The furniture was covered with white sheets, and a thin layer of dust had settled on surfaces throughout the house. It was clear that no one had been living there since her death, but everything was clean and orderly, just as she would have wanted it. Marcus dropped his duffel bag in the living room and walked through the house, remembering. Here was the kitchen table where she had taught him to play checkers. There was the bedroom where he had slept during summer visits, with the window that looked out over her prized rose garden. And in the back bedroom that had served as her office, he found something that made his breath catch in his throat. The walls were covered with photographs of Marcus throughout his military career. Pictures from boot camp, from his graduation from SEAL training, from various ceremonies and commendations. Letters and commendations were framed and displayed with obvious pride. In the center of it all was a large photo of Marcus in his dress uniform, taken just before his last deployment. His grandmother had created a shrine to his service, a testament to how proud she was of his accomplishments. Looking at it now, Marcus felt a wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. This woman had loved him unconditionally, had supported him through every challenge, had celebrated every victory. She had never made him feel like he was anything other than her beloved grandson. So why were the people in her community looking at him like he didn't belong? Marcus sat down in his grandmother's chair and tried to make sense of what had happened at the coffee shop. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe it was just natural curiosity about a newcomer. Maybe the woman's comments about his race were just awkward small talk, not malicious intent. But even as he tried to rationalize it, Marcus knew better. He had seen too much of the world, had dealt with too many different kinds of people to mistake genuine curiosity for something darker. What he had experienced at Bailey's wasn't just surprise about Eleanor Thompson's mixed-race grandson. It was discomfort, suspicion, and barely concealed hostility. As the evening shadows grew longer, Marcus unpacked his few belongings and tried to plan his next steps. He needed to find work, needed to integrate himself into the community, needed to build a new life in this place that was both familiar and foreign. His grandmother's house was paid off, and he had some savings from his military service, but he would need income eventually. More than that, though, he needed to find his place in Millfield. He had spent 12 years defending the principles of freedom and equality that America was supposed to represent. He had risked his life countless times for the idea that all people deserved respect and dignity regardless of their background. Now he was discovering that those principles were easier to defend on foreign battlefields than they were to live by in small American towns. Marcus looked again at the photographs on his grandmother's wall, at the evidence of a life spent in service to his country. Tomorrow he would venture out again into Millfield. He would try to find work, try to make connections, try to prove that he belonged in the community that had embraced his grandmother for so many years. What he didn't know yet was that his real battle was just beginning, and that the enemy he would face would be far more insidious and dangerous than any foreign threat he had encountered in his military career. Because the fight for acceptance in your own home, among people who share your nationality and your neighborhood, requires a different kind of courage entirely. The next morning would bring new challenges, new confrontations, and new tests of the character that had been forged in the crucible of military service. Marcus Thompson was about to discover that coming home was not the end of his war, but the beginning of a different kind of battle altogether. The hardware store bell jingled as Marcus pushed through the heavy glass door, a shopping list in his hand, and hope in his heart that today would be different from yesterday. He had spent the morning walking through his grandmother's house, making notes of repairs that needed attention, a loose floorboard in the kitchen, a dripping faucet in the bathroom, and several windows that stuck when he tried to open them. These were simple fixes, the kind of projects that would help him feel useful while he figured out his next career move. Miller's Hardware had been a Millfield institution for over 40 years, according to the faded sign above the entrance. The store's narrow aisles were packed with everything from garden hoses to paint cans, creating a maze that only regular customers could navigate with confidence. The smell of motor oil and metal polish hung in the air, mixed with something that reminded Marcus of his grandfather's garage from childhood visits. Behind the counter sat a heavy-set man in his 60s, his gray hair combed neatly to one side and his thick glasses perched on the end of his nose. He was reading a newspaper and didn't look up when Marcus entered, though the bell had announced his arrival clearly enough. Marcus spent several minutes gathering his supplies: sandpaper, wood stain, replacement hardware for the windows, and a new washer for the kitchen faucet. He worked methodically, checking items off his list and calculating costs in his head. The organization and attention to detail that had served him well in the military translated easily to civilian tasks. When he approached the counter with his arms full of supplies, the man behind the register finally looked up. Marcus saw the same expression he was beginning to recognize: surprise, followed by something harder to define. "Find everything you need?" the man asked, but his tone suggested he hoped the answer would be yes, so this interaction could end quickly. "I think so," Marcus replied, setting his purchases on the counter. "Though I might need some advice about the window hardware. The ones in my grandmother's house are pretty old." "Your grandmother's house?" The man's hands had stopped moving toward the register. "Eleanor Thompson's house on Maple Street. I'm Marcus, her grandson." The transformation in the man's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. His face, which had been merely unfriendly, hardened into something approaching hostility. He leaned back in his chair as if Marcus had suddenly developed a contagious disease. "Eleanor Thompson," he repeated slowly. "You're telling me you're Eleanor Thompson's grandson?" "That's right." Marcus kept his voice calm, though something in the man's tone was setting off alarm bells in his head. "Funny thing about that," the man said, pushing his glasses up his nose. "I knew Eleanor Thompson for 23 years. Bought supplies from me every month for all those little projects of hers. Real nice lady, always had a kind word and a story to share. And in all those years, all those conversations, she never once mentioned having a grandson who looked like you." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Not because they were unexpected, but because of the venom with which they were delivered. This wasn't curiosity or confusion. This was accusation. "Mrs. Thompson was my father's mother," Marcus explained, fighting to keep his voice level. "My father was her son David. He died when I was 8 years old." Something flickered across the man's face. Recognition, perhaps, or surprise. But it was quickly replaced by skepticism. "David Thompson," the man mused. "Yeah, I remember David. Heard he died young, somewhere out west. Car accident, wasn't it?" "Yes, sir. But see, here's what I don't understand." The man leaned forward, his elbows on the counter. "If you're really David's son, Eleanor's grandson, then where have you been all these years? Why didn't she ever mention you? Why didn't you come to her funeral?" The question about the funeral hit Marcus harder than he had expected. He had been deployed when his grandmother died, part of a classified mission that he couldn't abandon even for family emergencies. By the time he was able to get leave and return to the States, she had already been buried for 2 weeks. It was one of the biggest regrets of his life, made worse now by having to explain it to a hostile stranger. "I was overseas," Marcus said quietly. "Military service. I couldn't get back in time. Military service." The man's voice dripped with disbelief. "What branch?" "Navy. Special operations." "Navy SEALs, you mean?" "That's right." The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Right. And I suppose you've got some stories about saving the world and fighting terrorists." Marcus felt heat rising in his chest, but years of training kept his expression neutral. I did my job just like thousands of other servicemen and women. Your job. The man stood up, his considerable bulk making him an imposing figure behind the counter. Let me tell you something, son. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I don't appreciate people coming into my store with sob stories and fake credentials, trying to take advantage of a dead woman's memory. I'm not trying to take advantage of anyone, Marcus said, his voice carrying a warning tone that would have made his fellow SEALs take notice. I'm trying to buy some hardware supplies to fix up my grandmother's house. Your grandmother's house? The man repeated mockingly. You got any proof of that? Any documentation that says Eleanor Thompson left you that house? Marcus reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. From it, he extracted a folded copy of the will that the lawyer had given him, along with his military ID and driver's license. He placed them on the counter without a word. The man examined the documents with exaggerated care, holding them up to the light as if checking for forgeries. Marcus watched his expression change as he read through the will, saw the moment when he realized that everything Marcus had said was true. But instead of apologizing or backing down, the man's hostility seemed to intensify. Well, I'll be damned, he said, tossing the documents back across the counter. Looks like Eleanor did leave you the house. But you know what? That doesn't mean you belong here. Excuse me? You heard me. The man's voice rose, loud enough to be heard in the back of the store. Just because some old lady left you a house doesn't mean this community has to accept you. Eleanor Thompson was a good woman, but she obviously didn't understand what kind of problem she'd be creating by bringing your kind into a neighborhood like this. Marcus felt something snap inside him, a control wire that had been stretched to its breaking point. For a moment he was back in a compound in Afghanistan, facing down insurgents who questioned his right to exist. But this wasn't a war zone, and the enemy wasn't a foreign fighter. This was an American citizen in an American town, challenging his right to live in peace in his own country. My kind. Marcus's voice was deadly quiet now, the tone he used when giving orders in combat situations. The man behind the counter seemed to sense the change, but instead of backing down, he doubled down on his aggression. That's right, your kind. This is a good, quiet community full of decent, hard-working people. We don't need troublemakers coming in and stirring things up. Troublemakers. Marcus repeated the word as if tasting something bitter. What exactly do you think I'm going to do? Fix my grandmother's house? Shop at local businesses? Contribute to the community? Don't play dumb with me, son. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Your people have a way of changing places, of bringing in elements that don't belong. Pretty soon there'll be more of you. And then the crime starts, and the property values drop, and decent folks start looking for somewhere else to live. The racist assumptions came pouring out like water from a broken dam, and Marcus realized that this conversation had never been about his legitimacy as Eleanor Thompson's grandson. It had been about the color of his skin from the moment he walked through the door. Around the store, Marcus could sense other customers stopping their browsing to listen to the confrontation. He caught glimpses of faces peering around displays, heard the rustle of people positioning themselves to get a better view of the drama unfolding at the counter. Let me make sure I understand you correctly, Marcus said, his military bearing more evident now than ever. You're telling me that I don't belong in this community because of my race. I'm telling you that some people don't fit in certain places, the man replied, his face flushing red. And smart people know when they're not wanted. Not wanted by whom? By you? By everyone in Millfield? Or just by people who think skin color determines someone's worth? The store had gone completely quiet now. Even the old air conditioning unit seemed to have stopped humming. Marcus could feel eyes on him from every direction, could sense the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. Look, the man said, his tone suggesting he thought he was being reasonable. I'm not saying you're a bad person. I'm sure you served your country just fine, assuming that's even true. But this is a small town with small town values. People here like things the way they are. They don't want change, and they especially don't want the kind of change that comes with diversity. Marcus stared at the man for a long moment, processing not just the words but the casual way they were delivered. This wasn't a moment of heated anger or temporary loss of control. This was a carefully considered position, a worldview that had been developed over years and was now being presented as simple common sense. "What's your name?" Marcus asked quietly. "What? Your name? What is it?" The man hesitated, perhaps sensing that he had crossed a line from which there might be no return. "Tom Miller. This is Miller's Hardware. Been in my family for 2 generations. Well, Mr. Miller, I appreciate you being so direct about your feelings. It saves us both a lot of time and confusion." Marcus gathered up his documents and put them back in his wallet. Then he picked up his supplies from the counter, one item at a time. "What are you doing?" Miller demanded. "I'm taking my business elsewhere," Marcus replied calmly. "Assuming there's somewhere else in town that will serve customers based on their need for hardware rather than their skin color." "Now wait just a minute," Miller said, suddenly sounding less confident. "I never said I wouldn't sell to you. This is a business, after all." Marcus paused, a can of wood stain in his hand. "Mr. Miller, let me tell you something about myself. I spent 12 years as a Navy SEAL, serving my country in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. I've been shot at, bombed, and threatened by people who wanted to kill me simply because I'm an American. But you know what? Even they had the decency to be honest about their hatred." He set the wood stain back on the counter with deliberate care. "You, on the other hand, want to take my money while telling me I don't belong in the community where I'm spending it. You want to profit from serving someone you consider inferior. That's not just racist, Mr. Miller. It's cowardly." Miller's face had gone from red to purple. "You can't talk to me that way in my own store." "I can talk to you any way I choose," Marcus replied, his voice still calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "This is still America, despite what you seem to think. I have the right to speak freely, the right to live where I choose, and the right to be treated with basic human dignity. Those rights were paid for with the blood of better men than you, and I'll be damned if I'll let some small-town bigot make me forget that." Marcus turned and walked toward the door, leaving his supplies on the counter. Behind him, he could hear Miller sputtering with rage and indignation, but he didn't turn around. As he reached for the door handle, though, he heard something that made him pause. "Good for you, son," the voice came from somewhere behind him, quiet but clear enough to be heard throughout the store. Marcus turned to see an elderly man with a cane standing near the paint display. He was thin and frail-looking, probably in his 80s, but his eyes were bright and sharp. "What did you say, Frank?" Miller demanded. "I said good for him," the old man replied, louder this time. "Eleanor Thompson was one of the finest people I ever knew, and if she raised a grandson with that kind of backbone, then she did right by him." "Frank, you don't know what you're talking about," Miller snapped. "I know exactly what I'm talking about, Tom Miller. I know Eleanor Thompson never raised a child to back down from bullies, and I know this community would be a better place if more people had her grandson's courage and dignity." Marcus felt something loosen in his chest, a tightness he hadn't even realized was there. He nodded respectfully to the old man, who nodded back with a small smile. "Thank you, sir," Marcus said. "Name's Frank Morrison," the old man replied. "Your grandmother and I were friends for 40 years. She talked about you all the time, showed me your pictures, read me your letters. She was prouder of you than any grandmother had a right to be." Miller started to say something, but Frank Morrison held up his hand. "Tom, I've been shopping in this store since your father ran it, and I've never seen you treat a customer with such disrespect. Eleanor Thompson's grandson has more class in his little finger than you've shown in this entire conversation." The bell above the door chimed as Marcus stepped outside, but he could still hear Frank Morrison's voice carrying through the glass. "And another thing, Tom Miller. If I ever hear of you treating that young man or anyone else with such discourtesy again, I'll make sure everyone in this town knows what kind of man you really are." Marcus walked slowly back toward Maple Street, his mind spinning with everything that had just happened. The confrontation with Miller had been worse than anything he had experienced at the coffee shop, but Frank Morrison's support had been unexpected and deeply meaningful. It reminded him that not everyone in Millfield shared Miller's prejudices, even if they weren't always willing to speak up about it. As he reached his grandmother's house, Marcus realized that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of the situation. Yesterday, he had wondered if he was overreacting to subtle signs of discrimination. Today, there was no room for doubt. The battle lines were drawn, and he would have to decide how to respond. He could leave, of course, pack up his few belongings, sell the house, and find somewhere else to build his new life. It would certainly be easier than fighting for acceptance in a community where at least some people would never see him as anything more than an unwelcome outsider. But as Marcus looked at his grandmother's house, with its carefully tended garden and its memories of love and acceptance, he realized that leaving wasn't really an option. This was his home now, the place his grandmother had chosen for him, the inheritance she had left him, along with her house and her savings. He owed it to her memory and to his own self-respect to stay and fight for his place in the community she had loved. What Marcus didn't know yet was that his confrontation with Tom Miller would be just the beginning. Word travels fast in small towns, and by evening, everyone in Millfield would know about the argument at the hardware store. Some would side with Miller, reinforcing their own prejudices and preparing for further confrontation. Others would begin to question assumptions they had held for years, wondering if their community was as welcoming and tolerant as they had believed. And a few, like Frank Morrison, would begin to organize quietly, preparing to stand with Eleanor Thompson's grandson in the battles that lay ahead. Because sometimes the most important fights aren't won by the people who start them, but by the ordinary citizens who decide they can't remain silent when they see injustice in their own backyard. The next morning would bring new challenges and new choices, as Marcus Thompson continued his journey from decorated war hero to reluctant civil rights pioneer in the place he was trying to call home. The pounding on Marcus's front door came at 6:30 in the morning, sharp and urgent enough to wake him from the first solid sleep he'd had since arriving in Millfield. He rolled out of bed, instantly alert in the way that years of military training had programmed into his nervous system. In hostile territory, unexpected visitors at dawn usually meant trouble. Marcus pulled on jeans and a t-shirt, his bare feet silent on the hardwood floors as he moved through the house. The pounding came again, more insistent this time, followed by a voice he didn't recognize. "Open up. This is Sheriff Bradley." Through the front window's sheer curtains, Marcus could see 2 police cruisers parked in his driveway, their red and blue lights casting ominous patterns across his grandmother's carefully maintained flower beds. 3 officers stood on his porch, and he could see at least 2 more positioned around the perimeter of his property. Marcus opened the door slowly, keeping his hands visible and his movements deliberate. He had learned long ago that interactions with law enforcement required careful attention to body language and tone, especially for someone who looked like him. "Sheriff Bradley," Marcus said evenly. "What can I do for you?" Bradley was a different man than the one who had introduced himself at the coffee shop. Gone was the polite, if somewhat cool, demeanor. This was a police officer on official business, and his expression suggested that business was serious. "We need to talk, Mr. Thompson. Mind if we come in?" It wasn't really a request, despite the polite phrasing. Marcus stepped aside and gestured for them to enter, noting the way they positioned themselves strategically around his living room, 2 by the front door, 1 near the window, and Bradley himself in the center where he could observe everything. "What's this about, Sheriff? We had some complaints about you yesterday," Bradley said, pulling out a small notebook. "Seems there was some kind of disturbance at Miller's hardware store." Marcus felt a cold anger beginning to build in his chest. "A disturbance? Is that what Tom Miller called it? Why don't you tell me your version of what happened?" For the next 10 minutes, Marcus recounted the events at the hardware store in precise detail, keeping his tone professional and his language neutral. He described Miller's accusations, the racist comments about his kind and property values, and his own decision to take his business elsewhere. He also mentioned Frank Morrison's support and intervention. Bradley wrote in his notebook throughout the recitation, occasionally asking for clarification on specific points. The other officers remained silent, but Marcus could feel their eyes on him, evaluating, measuring, judging. "So you admit you became confrontational with Mr. Miller?" Bradley asked when Marcus finished. "I admit I told him I wouldn't do business with someone who insulted me because of my race." "If you consider that confrontational, then yes." Miller says you threatened him." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. "That's a lie, Sheriff. I never threatened anyone. I told him his behavior was cowardly, and I left his store. If he felt threatened by that, Maybe he should examine his own conscience. Bradley flipped through his notebook pages, as if consulting additional information. Miller also expressed some concerns about your claims of military service. He seems to think you might be misrepresenting your background. My military service is a matter of public record, Marcus replied, his voice carrying a warning edge. I'd be happy to provide you with my discharge papers, my service record, and contact information for my former commanding officers.
That won't be necessary right now, Bradley said quickly. But I do need to ask you about your intentions here in Millfield. My intentions? What you plan to do, how long you plan to stay, that sort of thing.
People are concerned about the kind of changes your presence might bring to the community. There it was. The same barely concealed racism that Marcus had encountered at Miller's, but dressed up in the language of law enforcement and community safety. The implication was clear. His mere presence in Millfield was seen as a threat by some residents, and the sheriff was here to assess that threat. Sheriff Bradley, Marcus said, his military bearing becoming more evident. Let me make something very clear. I am an American citizen, living in a house that I legally inherited from my grandmother. I have no criminal record, no history of violence outside of my military service to this country, and no intention of causing problems for anyone. But I also have no intention of allowing myself to be intimidated or driven away by people who don't like the color of my skin. Nobody's trying to drive you away, Bradley said, but his tone suggested otherwise. We're just trying to maintain peace in the community. Peace for whom? For people like Tom Miller who think they can insult and degrade their customers without consequences? Or peace for everyone, including citizens who happen to be black? Bradley closed his notebook and signaled to his officers. Mr. Thompson, I'm going to give you some advice. This is a small town with certain expectations about behavior and fitting in. You might find it easier to adjust if you kept a lower profile, avoided confrontations, and gave people time to get used to your presence. Marcus stared at the sheriff for a long moment, processing not just the words but the mentality behind them. This was a law enforcement officer, sworn to protect and serve all citizens equally, suggesting that he should make himself smaller and more palatable to accommodate the prejudices of others. Sheriff, I spent 12 years fighting for American values overseas. I'm not about to compromise those same values now that I'm home. Sometimes compromise is necessary to keep the peace, Bradley replied. I'd hate to see this situation escalate into something more serious. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with recognizing a hostile situation, but he also felt something else, a deep, abiding anger at the injustice of it all. Are you threatening me, Sheriff? I'm advising you. There's a difference. I see. And what happens if I don't take your advice? What happens if I continue to live my life as a free American citizen in my own home? Bradley's expression hardened. Let's hope we don't have to find out. After the officers left, Marcus stood in his living room trying to process what had just happened. A law enforcement official had essentially told him to keep his head down and accept discrimination in order to avoid escalating the situation. The message was clear. The problem wasn't the racism he was experiencing, but his unwillingness to quietly endure it. Marcus walked to his grandmother's office and stared at the wall of photographs documenting his military service, medals, commendations, pictures with fellow servicemen of all races working together toward common goals. He thought about the oath he had sworn as a young sailor, the promise to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. What he was facing in Millfield wasn't foreign terrorism or military aggression. It was something more insidious and, in some ways, more dangerous. The systematic attempt to deny him the basic rights of citizenship in his own country. The right to live where he chose, to be treated with dignity, to participate fully in his community. The phone in the kitchen rang, startling him from his thoughts. Marcus hesitated before answering, wondering if it might be more harassment or threats. Hello? Mr. Thompson? This is Frank Morrison. We met yesterday at Miller's. Marcus felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. Yes, sir. Mr. Discovery. Morrison, thank you again for speaking up yesterday. That's actually why I'm calling. I heard about Sheriff Bradley's visit this morning, and I wanted you to know that not everyone in this town agrees with his approach. How did you hear about the sheriff's visit? Marcus asked. Frank Morrison chuckled dryly. Son, this is a small town, and 5 police cars show up at someone's house at dawn, people notice. Word gets around fast. And 5 cars? Marcus had only seen 2. They had backup units positioned around the corner out of sight. Made quite an impression on the neighbors. I'm sure that was the point. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. The show of force had been deliberate, designed to intimidate not just him, but anyone else who might be thinking of supporting him. Mr. Took, Morrison, I appreciate your concern, but I don't want you getting involved in this. It could cause problems for you. Son, I'm 83 years old. I've lived through the Depression, World War II, Korea, and 60 years of watching this country struggle with its own conscience. At my age, I'm more worried about doing what's right than about making enemies. There was something in the old man's voice that reminded Marcus of his grandmother, a kind of stubborn dignity that couldn't be intimidated or bought off. What do you think I should do? Marcus asked. I think you should keep being exactly who you are. Don't let them make you smaller to make them more comfortable. Your grandmother didn't raise you to back down from bullies, and she wouldn't want you to start now. After the call ended, Marcus spent the morning working on repairs around the house, using physical labor to process his emotions and plan his next steps. He replaced the washer in the kitchen faucet, sanded down the loose floorboard, and began working on the sticky windows. The familiar rhythm of manual work helped clear his mind and focus his thoughts. By afternoon, he had made a decision. He would go back into town not to confront anyone or prove a point, but simply to live his life as a normal citizen. He needed groceries, and hiding in his house would only validate the sheriff's suggestion that he keep a low profile. The grocery store parking lot was busier than he had expected for a Tuesday afternoon. Marcus noticed several people doing double takes when they saw him, and a few conversations stopped abruptly as he passed. But there were also some nods of acknowledgement, and one elderly woman actually smiled at him. Inside the store, Marcus went about his shopping methodically, selecting items for a week's worth of meals and household supplies. He was comparing prices on cereal when he became aware that someone was watching him intently. A woman in her 40s, well-dressed and carrying herself with an air of authority, was standing at the end of the aisle studying him. "Excuse me," she said, approaching him with a determined expression. "You're Marcus Thompson, aren't you?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm Carol Winters. I'm on the town council, and I wanted to welcome you to Millfield." Marcus studied her carefully, trying to read the sincerity in her expression. After his experiences with Miller and Sheriff Bradley, he was naturally suspicious of anyone in a position of local authority. "Thank you," he said cautiously. "I also wanted to apologize for some of the treatment you've received since arriving in town. That's not who we are as a community, and it's not the kind of behavior we want to be known for." "Some of the treatment?" Marcus repeated. Carol Winters glanced around the store as if checking to see who might be listening. "I heard about what happened at Miller's Hardware yesterday, and about Sheriff Bradley's visit this morning. Neither of those incidents represents the values that most of us in Millfield hold dear, but they represent the values that some people hold," Marcus pointed out. "Yes," she admitted. "Unfortunately, they do. But I want you to know that there are people in this community who believe in treating all residents with respect and dignity, regardless of their background." Marcus set down the box of cereal he had been examining. "Ms. Winters, can I ask you something?" "Of course. If you and other people on the town council feel this way, why did Sheriff Bradley feel comfortable coming to my house with 5 police cars to intimidate me for standing up to a racist store owner?" Carol Winters's face reddened. "I didn't know about the police cars. Tom Bradley doesn't always consult with the council before taking action. Maybe he should. You're absolutely right, and I intend to bring this up at our next meeting." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "Mr. Thompson, would you be willing to attend a town council meeting? We meet every Thursday evening at 7 o'clock in the community center. I think it would be beneficial for everyone if you could share your perspective on what you've experienced here." Marcus considered the offer. On one hand, it might be an opportunity to address the situation publicly and build support among reasonable community members. On the other hand, it could easily turn into a confrontational circus. That would make things worse. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "I hope you will." Your grandmother was very active in community affairs. She would often attend our meetings and wasn't shy about speaking her mind when she thought we were making mistakes. She never mentioned the racial attitudes in this town, Marcus said. Carol Winters looked uncomfortable. Your grandmother was unique in her perspective. She saw people as individuals rather than as members of groups. Not everyone shared her open-mindedness, but everyone respected her enough to keep their opinions to themselves when she was around. And now that she's gone, now some people feel free to express opinions they kept hidden before. That's not your fault, and it's not something you should have to tolerate. After finishing his grocery shopping, Marcus drove home feeling somewhat encouraged by his conversation with Carol Winters. At least there were some people in positions of authority who seemed genuinely concerned about the discrimination he was facing. Whether they had the influence and determination to do something about it remained to be seen. As he pulled into his driveway, Marcus noticed a car parked across the street that hadn't been there when he left. A man sat behind the wheel, making no attempt to hide the fact that he was watching the house. When Marcus waved in his direction, the man started his engine and drove away. Inside the house, Marcus found that someone had left something on his front porch while he was gone. It was a manila envelope with his name written on it in block letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message composed of words cut from newspapers and magazines. This isn't your place. Leave now before something bad happens. You have been warned. Marcus studied the anonymous threat, feeling not fear but a cold, calculating anger. This was no longer about awkward social interactions or individual prejudice. Someone was trying to intimidate him into leaving town through anonymous threats, and that crossed a line from ignorance into criminal behavior. He photographed the letter with his phone, sealed it in a plastic bag to preserve any potential fingerprints, and placed it in his grandmother's desk. Then he sat down and began writing a detailed account of everything that had happened since his arrival in Millfield. The confrontation at the coffee shop, the racist encounter at Miller's Hardware, Sheriff Bradley's intimidation visit, and now this anonymous threat. If things escalated further, he would need documentation, and if necessary, he would use every resource at his disposal, including his military contacts and federal authorities, to ensure that his rights as an American citizen were protected. Marcus Thompson had faced down terrorists and insurgents in some of the world's most dangerous places. He wasn't about to be driven from his own home by small-town bigots who hid behind anonymous letters and police badges. The battle for his place in Millfield was just beginning, and he intended to win it, not just for himself but for every other person who had ever been told they didn't belong in the land of the free. The next few days would test everything he had learned about strategy, patience, and the kind of courage that doesn't come from weapons training, but from an unshakable belief in what's right. And they would determine whether Millfield, Pennsylvania was ready to live up to the American values that Marcus Thompson had spent 12 years of his life defending. The Thursday evening town council meeting drew a crowd unlike any Carol Winters had seen in her 8 years as a council member. The community center's main room, which normally held maybe 25 people for monthly gatherings, was packed wall-to-wall with over 100 residents. Extra chairs had been brought in from the adjacent rooms, and people were standing along the walls and crowding near the doorways. Marcus arrived 15 minutes early, as was his habit from years of military punctuality. He had chosen his clothing carefully. Khaki slacks, a navy blue button-down shirt, and polished leather shoes. Professional but not intimidating, respectful but not submissive. He wanted to project the image of a serious, responsible citizen rather than the threatening outsider that some people seemed determined to see. As he entered the community center, conversations stopped and heads turned. Marcus felt the familiar weight of being examined, evaluated, and judged by dozens of pairs of eyes simultaneously. Some faces showed curiosity, others hostility, and a few displayed what might have been sympathy or support, but all showed interest. Whatever else happened tonight, his presence had succeeded in galvanizing the community's attention. Frank Morrison was already there, sitting in the front row with his cane propped against his knee. He nodded respectfully when Marcus entered, and gestured to an empty seat beside him. Marcus accepted the invitation gratefully, knowing he would need at least one ally in the room. "Quite a turnout," Frank observed quietly. "More than I expected," Marcus replied. "Word gets around. People want to see what all the fuss is about." Carol Winters called the meeting to order at 7 o'clock sharp, but the usual business of budget reports and zoning applications was clearly not what anyone had come to hear. The tension in the room was palpable, like the electricity in the air before a thunderstorm. "Before we begin tonight's regular agenda," Winters announced, "I've asked Mr. Marcus Thompson to address the council and the community about his recent experiences as a new resident of Millfield." A murmur ran through the crowd, not entirely welcoming. Marcus stood and made his way to the small podium at the front of the room, acutely aware that every step was being scrutinized. When he turned to face the audience, he saw a sea of faces representing the full spectrum of small-town America. Working families, retirees, business owners, young parents, teenagers who had been dragged along by their parents. And in the back of the room, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, was Sheriff Bradley. "Thank you, Miss Winters, and thank you all for coming tonight," Marcus began, his voice carrying the clear, confident tone that had served him well in military briefings. "I know many of you are curious about who I am and why I've come to Millfield, so I'd like to start by telling you a little about myself." For the next 10 minutes, Marcus outlined his background, his childhood as a military brat, his decision to enlist in the Navy, his training as a SEAL, and his 12 years of service in various combat zones around the world. He spoke about the values that had guided him through his military career: duty, honor, courage, and commitment to protecting American freedoms for all citizens. The room remained absolutely silent during his recitation, and Marcus could see some attitude shifting as people processed the reality of his service record. Whatever they might think about his race, it was hard to question the patriotism of someone who had risked his life repeatedly in defense of their country. "I came to Millfield," Marcus continued, "because my grandmother, Eleanor Thompson, left me her house and her savings, along with something even more valuable, her love for this community." She spoke often about the good people of Millfield, about the kindness and generosity she experienced here over 60 years of residency. Marcus paused, allowing his eyes to move across the faces in front of him. "Unfortunately, my experience in Millfield has been somewhat different from hers. In the 5 days since I arrived, I've been questioned about my legitimacy as her grandson, insulted because of my race, threatened with arrest for defending my dignity, and warned anonymously to leave town or face unspecified consequences." The murmur that ran through the crowd this time was different, more uncomfortable. Some people shifted in their seats, while others leaned forward with increased attention. "I want to be very clear about something," Marcus said, his voice gaining strength. "I didn't come here looking for trouble. I didn't come here to change anyone's mind about race or to lecture anyone about tolerance. I came here to honor my grandmother's memory and to build a quiet life in the community she loved. But I also didn't come here to accept second-class treatment or to pretend that discrimination is acceptable as long as it's polite." Tom Miller, the hardware store owner, was sitting in the third row with his wife. Marcus saw him whisper something to the man beside him, his face red with either embarrassment or anger. "Some of you may have heard about my interaction with Mr. Miller at his hardware store," Marcus continued, looking directly at Miller as he spoke. "Mr. Miller expressed concern that people like me would bring crime and declining property values to Millfield. He suggested that I didn't belong in this community because of my race." Miller stood up abruptly. "Now wait just a minute. Mr. Miller," Carol Winters interrupted firmly. "Mr. Thompson has the floor. You'll have an opportunity to speak when he's finished." Miller remained standing for a moment, clearly wanting to argue, but eventually sat back down under the weight of disapproving stares from other community members. "I don't blame Mr. Miller for his attitudes," Marcus said, surprising everyone, including Miller himself. "Prejudice isn't something people are born with. It's learned, usually from family and community influences over many years. What I do object to is the suggestion that I should quietly accept discriminatory treatment in order to keep the peace." Marcus moved away from the podium, walking closer to the audience so he could speak to them more directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've spent 12 years fighting for American values in foreign countries. I've seen what happens when societies allow prejudice and hatred to go unchallenged. I've witnessed the consequences of good people remaining silent while bad people spread poison. And I can tell you from personal experience, it has to be defended every day in every community by ordinary citizens who decide they won't tolerate injustice. The room had grown completely quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence now. People were listening, really listening to what he was saying. "I'm not asking anyone to like me," Marcus continued. "I'm not asking anyone to change their personal beliefs or their private opinions. What I am asking for is the same thing every American citizen deserves: the right to live peacefully in my own home, to be treated with basic courtesy in public establishments, and to participate in community life without having to constantly defend my right to exist." An older woman near the front raised her hand. "Mr. Thompson, what exactly do you want from us?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "I want to be judged by my character and my actions, not by my skin color. I want to contribute to this community in positive ways, just like my grandmother did. And I want other people who might face similar challenges to know that standing up for yourself is not only possible but necessary. What if some people are never going to accept you?" Another voice called out. "Then that's their choice," Marcus replied. "But it doesn't give them the right to discriminate against me or to use their positions of authority to intimidate me. And it doesn't mean I have to make myself smaller or less visible to accommodate their prejudices." Sheriff Bradley pushed himself away from the wall and raised his hand. "Thompson, I'd like to address some of the claims you've made about our law enforcement response." Carol Winters looked uncertain. "Sheriff, this isn't really the appropriate forum for—" "I think the community deserves to hear both sides," Bradley interrupted. Marcus nodded. "I have no objection to the sheriff speaking." Bradley walked to the front of the room, his uniform and badge giving him an automatic authority that Marcus's civilian clothes couldn't match. "Mr. Sabathuk, Thompson has suggested that my department engaged in intimidation tactics when we visited his residence," Bradley began. "I want to assure everyone that we simply responded to legitimate concerns from community members about a potential disturbance." "What kind of disturbance?" Frank Morrison called out, his voice sharp despite his age. "We received reports of threatening behavior at Miller's Hardware," Bradley replied. "From whom?" Morrison pressed. Bradley hesitated. "From concerned citizens." "From Tom Miller, you mean?" Morrison said. "One person. One person who was embarrassed because he got called out for his racist comments, so he ran to you claiming he'd been threatened." A buzz of conversation erupted throughout the room. Carol Winters called for order, but it took several minutes for people to quiet down. "The point is," Bradley continued, "we have to take all reports of potential violence seriously, especially when they involve someone with military training who might pose a risk to public safety." The implication hit Marcus like a physical blow. Bradley was suggesting that his military service, the thing he was most proud of, made him inherently dangerous to the community. "Sheriff Bradley," Marcus said, his voice deadly calm, "are you suggesting that American veterans are a threat to public safety?" "I'm suggesting that someone with advanced combat training who becomes confrontational in local businesses needs to be monitored closely." The murmur that went through the crowd this time was clearly disapproving. Marcus realized that Bradley had made a serious tactical error by impugning the reputation of military veterans in a room full of people who probably had family members or friends who had served. "Sheriff," Carol Winters said, "I think you should clarify your position on this issue." Before Bradley could respond, Frank Morrison struggled to his feet, using his cane for support. "Tom Bradley," Morrison said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "I've known you since you were a boy, and I knew your father before you. Your father was sheriff in this town for 20 years, and he understood something that you apparently don't." Bradley's face reddened, but he remained silent. "Your father understood that the badge you wear doesn't make you the judge of who belongs in this community. It makes you the protector of everyone's rights, including the rights of people you personally don't like." Morrison's words carried the weight of age and moral authority, and the room was completely silent as he continued. "This young man served his country with distinction for 12 years. He put his life on the line defending the freedoms that you and I take for granted. And instead of thanking him for his service, you show up at his house with 5 police cars to intimidate him for having the audacity to expect equal treatment in a hardware store." Morrison turned to face the crowd, his eyes blazing with an intensity that belied his frail appearance. "Eleanor Thompson was my friend for 40 years. She was one of the finest people any of us ever knew, and she raised her grandson to be a man of character and principle. If we can't find room in our community for someone like Marcus Thompson, then we need to take a long, hard look at what kind of community we've become. The old man sat down heavily, and the room remained silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, people began to applaud. It started with just a few individuals, but quickly spread throughout the room until nearly everyone was clapping. Even some who had appeared hostile earlier were joining in the ovation. Sheriff Bradley stood at the front of the room, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger, clearly realizing that the momentum of the meeting had shifted decisively against him. Carol Winters regained control of the meeting and opened the floor for other community members to speak. What followed was a series of testimonials that revealed the true character of Millfield. A teacher talked about the importance of teaching children about tolerance and acceptance. A business owner expressed concern about the town's reputation if word got out about discriminatory treatment of residents. A veteran of the Korean War thanked Marcus for his service and apologized for the treatment he had received. But there were also dissenting voices. A woman complained about outside agitators coming in and stirring up trouble where none had existed before. A man expressed concerns about property values and changing demographics. Another person suggested that some communities were naturally more suitable for certain types of people. Through it all, Marcus listened carefully, taking mental notes about who his potential allies and adversaries might be. What struck him most was how the evening had revealed the deep divisions that already existed within the community. His arrival hadn't created these tensions, it had simply brought them to the surface. As the meeting wound down, Carol Winters made a surprising announcement. Based on tonight's discussion, I'm proposing that the town council establish a community relations committee to address issues of discrimination and promote understanding among all residents. I'd like to ask Mr. Thompson if he would be willing to serve on this committee. Marcus felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes focused on him. This was a moment of decision that would define not just his relationship with Millfield, but his entire future in the town. I'd be honored to serve, he said simply. The applause that followed was even louder than before, and Marcus realized that something fundamental had changed in the room. He wasn't the threatening outsider anymore. He was a community member, someone who had earned the right to be heard and respected. As people began to file out of the community center, many stopped to introduce themselves to Marcus and express their support. Others avoided eye contact and left quickly, but even their reaction told him something important. The lines were now clearly drawn, and everyone in Millfield would have to choose which side they were on. Sheriff Bradley approached him as the crowd thinned out, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Thompson," he said quietly, "I hope you understand that I was just trying to maintain order in the community." Marcus studied the sheriff's face, seeing not malice but weakness. Bradley wasn't a committed racist like Tom Miller. He was someone who had allowed himself to be influenced by the loudest voices in the community, without thinking through the consequences of his actions. "Sheriff," Marcus replied, "maintaining order means protecting everyone's rights equally. I hope we can work together in the future to make sure that happens." Bradley nodded uncertainly and walked away, leaving Marcus with the distinct impression that their relationship would be different going forward. Frank Morrison was one of the last to leave, moving slowly with his cane but radiating satisfaction with the evening's events. "You did good tonight, son," he said to Marcus. "Your grandmother would have been proud. Thank you, Morrison, for everything. This is just the beginning, you know. The real work starts now." Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what the old man meant. Tonight had been about establishing his legitimacy and his right to be in Millfield. Tomorrow would be about proving that he deserved to stay, and that his presence could make the community better rather than just different. As Marcus walked home through the quiet streets of Millfield, he reflected on how much had changed in just 1 week. He had arrived as a stranger trying to hide from his past, hoping to find peace in his grandmother's house. Now he was a community leader, committed to fighting for justice, not just for himself, but for anyone else who might face similar challenges. The anonymous threat letter was still in his grandmother's desk, and he suspected there might be more attempts to intimidate him in the days ahead. But tonight had shown him something important. He wasn't alone in this fight. There were good people in Millfield who were willing to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult or uncomfortable. Marcus Thompson, decorated Navy SEAL, had found his new mission. And this time, The battle would be fought not in foreign lands against foreign enemies, but in his own backyard, against the forces of prejudice and hatred that threatened the very foundations of American democracy. The war for his place in Millfield was far from over, but tonight had been a decisive victory, and Marcus was just getting started. 6 months after the town council meeting, Marcus Thompson had settled into a routine that felt remarkably normal. He had found work as a security consultant for local businesses, helping them assess vulnerabilities and develop emergency response plans. His military background, once viewed with suspicion, had become an asset that local employers valued. The Community Relations Committee he served on had organized several successful events, including a Veterans Appreciation Dinner and a diversity workshop for local business owners. The anonymous threats had stopped after the third letter, and Sheriff Bradley had evolved from an antagonist into something approaching an ally. Tom Miller still wouldn't serve him at the hardware store, but Miller's son had taken over much of the day-to-day operations and treated Marcus with professional courtesy. Progress was slow but measurable. On a crisp October morning, Marcus was working in his grandmother's garden when he noticed an unfamiliar car pulling into his driveway. It was an expensive sedan with government plates, and the two men who got out wore the kind of unremarkable suits that practically screamed federal law enforcement. Marcus set down his pruning shears and walked toward them, his military bearing automatically asserting itself. After years of dealing with various government agencies, he could spot federal agents from a considerable distance. "Mr. Thompson," the older of the two men said, extending his hand. "I'm Special Agent David Chen, FBI. This is Agent Rodriguez. We were wondering if we could have a few minutes of your time." Marcus shook both their hands, noting their firm grips and direct eye contact. These weren't men who were here to intimidate or threaten. This was something else entirely. "Of course. Would you like to come inside?" They settled in his grandmother's living room, the agent sitting on the couch while Marcus took the armchair across from them. Agent Chen pulled out a small notebook, while Rodriguez activated a digital recorder after asking Marcus's permission. "Mr. Thompson," Chen began, "we understand you've had some challenges since moving to Millfield. Discrimination, harassment, that sort of thing." "Some, yes, but things have improved considerably over the past few months." "We're particularly interested in the anonymous threats you received," Rodriguez said. "Do you still have copies of those letters?" Marcus nodded and retrieved the plastic-wrapped letters from his grandmother's desk. The agents examined them carefully, taking photographs and making notes. "Mr. Thompson, what we're about to tell you is part of an ongoing federal investigation," Chen said. "We need your word that you won't discuss this with anyone until we give you clearance to do so. You have it." Chen exchanged a glance with his partner before continuing. "The discrimination and harassment you experienced in Millfield wasn't random. It was orchestrated as part of a larger operation, designed to test community responses to racial integration." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What kind of operation?" "Are you familiar with the name Robert Sterling?" Rodriguez asked. Marcus shook his head. "Sterling is a white supremacist leader based in western Pennsylvania. For the past 3 years, he's been developing what he calls community resistance models, strategies for organizing local opposition to racial diversity in small towns." Chen opened his notebook and consulted his notes. "Sterling's organization identifies communities with minimal racial diversity and then engineers situations designed to provoke hostile reactions. They plant agitators, spread propaganda, and use local law enforcement connections to create an atmosphere of intimidation." "You're saying that what happened to me was planned? Not specifically to you," Rodriguez clarified. "But when you inherited your grandmother's house and moved to Millfield, Sterling's people saw an opportunity. They activated sleeper agents in the community and began spreading propaganda designed to turn residents against you." Marcus leaned back in his chair, trying to process this information. "Sleeper agents? People who have been recruited to Sterling's cause but maintain normal lives in their communities until called upon to act," Chen explained. "We believe at least 3 residents of Millfield are part of this network." "Tom Miller?" "Miller isn't a recruited agent," Rodriguez said. "He's what Sterling's organization calls a useful idiot. someone whose existing prejudices can be manipulated to serve their purposes. The real agents work more subtly, influencing opinion leaders and spreading rumors. Chen flipped through his notebook. For example, the complaints that led to Sheriff Bradley's visit to your house didn't come from Tom Miller. They came from someone who called the sheriff's office anonymously and claimed to be a concerned neighbor. We've traced that call to a burner phone registered to one of Sterling's operatives. Marcus felt a surge of anger, not just at the manipulation, but at his own naivety. How long have you known about this? We've been tracking Sterling's activities for 2 years, Rodriguez said. Millfield was one of several test communities he selected. We've been monitoring communications and gathering evidence for federal charges. Why didn't you warn me? Because we needed to see how the operation would unfold, Chen said. And frankly, we weren't sure how you would respond. Sterling's strategy depends on provoking either violent retaliation or complete capitulation from his targets. You did neither. What did I do? You fought back intelligently, Rodriguez said. You documented everything. You built community support. You used legal and social pressure rather than violence. You essentially defeated Sterling's strategy by refusing to play by his rules. Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where he had been watched and photographed by Sterling's operatives. Who were the agents in town? That's part of why we're here today, Chen said. We're ready to make arrests, but we wanted to give you advance warning. One of the people you've been interacting with regularly is going to be taken into custody. Who? Rodriguez consulted his notes. Dr. Patricia Caldwell. She's been living in Millfield for 18 months, posing as a retired psychology professor. In reality, she's one of Sterling's top strategists. Marcus felt the floor shift beneath his feet. Dr. Caldwell had been one of the most vocal supporters of the Community Relations Committee. She had organized workshops, given presentations on unconscious bias, and positioned herself as one of the most progressive voices in the community. That's impossible. She's been fighting against racism, not promoting it. That was her cover, Chen explained. Sterling's newer strategies involve infiltrating anti-racism efforts to gather intelligence and sow division from within. Caldwell was documenting everything your committee did, looking for ways to undermine your efforts. What about the other agents? Michael, this isn't your place, they said. Then the Navy SEAL revealed the truth.